all about political history and social history and cultural history and all of that. Spatial history is not a field that is particularly well developed. So the quick way of explaining what spatial history is it's an attempt to understand in historical terms, why where matters or why location matters. Now, there are two parts to that process. And one was kind of the first phase of thinking spatially was just beautifully articulated by Nikolay and his team, the phase of thinking about location, right? Putting something on the map, just figuring out where things are. It's a very difficult thing to do, but it's only the first phase of thinking spatially. The second phase is the last bullet point that you had on your slides, right? Where you begin to think about the relationships between places and the relationships between different sets of data. So when you begin thinking about connections, when you start thinking about issues of proximity and distance and density and access, change across space and not just change across time, then you're moving into the world of spatial history. And one of the reasons for doing this kind of work is I think there's a huge array of research questions that historians have just never asked because we haven't necessarily trained ourselves to think in this way. And that's one of the promises of doing, or the opportunities, right, in this work. So the project is just, it's just my attempt to work through this messy thing that I just explained to you. And I'm sure that I'm doing it wrong, and I'm sure there are people who will do it better, and that's great. This is just my attempt. I guess you have to forward it for me, sorry. Okay, so I haven't used the word GIS yet, GIS. It is the kind of word that makes some people run out of the room because it sounds very scary, and it's a thing that historians don't usually do, right? We think about our sources. We think about archival documents. We don't talk about them as data. That sounds like doing some sort of kind of reductivist violence, right, to the documentary record of the past. I understand, and I know you might feel squeamish about it, and that's okay. But I am going to use words like GIS and data because they make sense here. So GIS is Geographic Information Science. It can also be Geographic Information System. But essentially, it's the software and the set of methods and approaches that have been developed by people who were definitely not historians, right, to ask spatial questions. So GIS, this is one of the big solutions that the world has developed to major global logistical questions, right? And some of the biggest GIS software providers like to say very splashy things like maps rule the world. And by the way, we make the software that makes the maps, and therefore, we rule the world kind of thing. There are a couple of companies, especially in the US, that do make those claims. And there's something to that, right? How things move across space, right? That's what we're talking about. That's what we're thinking about. And in the modern world, you think about the implications of how gas or oil or bread, wheat moves from a field through a port that may or may not be blockaded, right? And then out to markets. So GIS provides a way of looking at huge amounts of information in this spatial context. It's important to note that it was not designed by historians or by humanists at all. And social scientists tend to be pretty, comfortable within this world, but we tend not to be, right? And working in the world of geographic information science forces us to deal with our materials differently, and to do things to them that, that might feel a little bit artificial or awkward. So one of the reasons why I think doing historical GIS work is fun is that one of the important things to do is to remember that we as historians are not victims here, right? Yes, we are going to have to take, an amazingly rich archive of information about sacred spaces and shoehorn it into a CSV file, right? In order to make Google Maps understand what you're talking about, right? So that's us making our material conform to the technical specifications of the software, right? That's one part of it. But the really great part of it is starting when we start to think about what we can do as scholars, as historians, as humanists, to force software to change so that it can deal with our sources better. Because as I'm sure all of you in this room know, historical sources are inconsistent, incoherent, they have gaps, they don't sit together well in a pretty table. And computers are not built to deal with that well. So we have a lot to teach the world of GIS about how to deal with data. And that's actually quite an important and interesting thing to think about. And one of the really dynamic ways I think we can connect the history of sacred space in Kazakhstan, right? Or the history of, ship traffic in the Black Sea in the 19th century to what big companies are doing in the world, right? What Amazon is doing, what Google is doing, and how they think about data. So there's some fun things to think about with GIS. Okay, next slide. It's always fun to have kind of a meme image in your presentation, right? So GIS has the potential to be this, right? Spending 4 days trying to automate grunt work, right? And something that you could have done in 4 hours by yourself. So we are definitely operating in the world where you have to carefully analyze what can be done by a computer more quickly and more efficiently than what you yourself can do. When people start thinking about digital humanities and allowing computers into our work, I think a lot of people are resistant to it because they think that it's kind of, what is the value of the scholar anymore if my computer can do my work for you, right, for me? And that's not the case at all. And I'm sure that Nikolay will agree with me that doing this kind of work shows very quickly the value and the necessity of regional expertise, of scholars who have been trained in their disciplines, who know how to deal with the sources that have been produced, right? So this is important. There can be a lot of work on the technical side, but I want everyone in this room to know that should you ever decide, or if you've already decided to kind of wade into this world, the training that you have as a scholar, as a humanist, as a historian, as whatever you are in this room, political scientist, is necessary and essential to that process, right? Okay, another big question. Is everyone doing okay? Are you with me so far? Okay, all right. Another big question is, what is geographical information? This is a word that, or a term that is used frequently. I use it a lot. Geographical information, it sounds, quite obvious. It's information that describes any place on the surface of the earth and anything nearish the earth, because GIS is actually starting to get really good at even mapping things that are in near space. So it's not just terrestrial, but it's basically anything that you can find that has location on the surface of the earth is geographical information potentially. And it has all kinds of different appearances. This is geographical information. It is also a map, but it contains a lot of geographical information. And one of the things I want to do is just kind of show you what the process of extracting geographical information from maps looks like. So we'll do that in a minute. This also is geographical information. And if you have ever spent a day in the, at IMPERIIA or any archive of the Russian Empire or Kazakhstan, I'm sure you have encountered tabular data or data that simply is associated with an administrative unit of some kind. Gubernia, uyezdi, goroda, whatever, auli. If it is associated with something you can find on the surface of the earth, this too is geographical information. Geographical information comes in qualitative and visual packaging as well. And one of the, I think, really important things that we can do, and I think your project is also doing, is bringing in sources that are not numeric, right? We're not just talking about how things have been counted in the past. We want to bring in a whole range of source material into our work, and we can, because all of it has kind of place to it. While we're at it, what is a map? I don't know if I really want to get into that this morning. If you want to in Q&A, we can do it. It's a question that I subject my students to at some point every semester, and they look at me and I say, well, okay, so what is a map? and I think I've done this to you, Penn, right? And they say, oh God, right, what is a map? Well, it's an image, the representation of the surface of the earth, right? I mean, don't you know this, Professor O'Neill? And then we have a long conversation about what is and is not a map and how far can we push this. So I won't make you do that right now unless you're, feeling like you have to. The better question isn't what is a map. The better question is definitely why map. And this is a really important thing to think about. You always need to ask yourself, why am I about to do what I think I'm about to do? So if I'm going to set out to map all of the sacred spaces in Kazakhstan, I probably need to be asking myself, why am I doing this? What kinds of questions am I trying to answer? And why do I need a map to do it? Do I need a map? Because oftentimes you don't. Sometimes you do, but you need to always ask yourself that question because there is so much grunt work involved. And if the questions that you're asking are not spatial, you don't need a map, right? So it's important to ask. So this is Aristotle. And I always like to bring him in because he has thoughts about why you should map things. He said all kinds of really wonderfully brilliant things, right? To perceive is to suffer. No great mind has ever existed without a touch of madness. That is one of my favorites. And then he said this, and this is a little funky, but he said, what is not is nowhere. Where, for instance, is a goat stag or a sphinx, right? That's kind of crazy, but the idea is what is not is nowhere. Meaning, and that's a goat stag. That was an attempt at illustrating a goat stag from a British kind of 18th century magazine. The flip side of that is everything that exists is somewhere. And if it is somewhere, it's locatable, right? So Aristotle kind of himself makes this argument that, yes, we should be mapping things because everything has location. It's essential to existence and therefore essential to history. So location matters. Aristotle said so. So I don't need to defend myself anymore because I have him to rely on. But Vermeer also said this, right? This is a thing. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. The relevance and the kind of fascination factor of geographical information and of maps and of globes and permeates the work of some of the greatest artists, right, of all time. And I love these paintings by Vermeer because they have this really tactile quality and this sense that you're reaching out and touching space, right? You're reaching out and touching the past. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, just recall the Vermeer's work and that sense of space. Go ahead. Okay, so let me show you a couple of things that I have done. And this is the part where it's going to be very important for you to ask questions, interrupt me if something isn't clear. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first thing. I think I'm going to start with the first thing I did way back in the day. I thought to myself, I was teaching courses on Imperial Russian history, and I thought my undergraduates don't know, they might know where Moscow is, but they definitely don't know where Semipalatinsk is, right? They definitely don't know even where Vladivostok is. I need a nice set of maps that I can use to show them the space of the Russian Empire. How hard could it be to find some really great maps to use with my students? And in my case, I wanted English language maps. And it turned out it wasn't actually all that easy to find maps that were approachable for students. So I thought, how hard could it be to make my own? And 10 years later, here I am. All right. But one of the first things I did, I found this is the Geographical Atlas of the Russian Empire produced in the 1820s by the General Staff. It's the first comprehensive and cartographically modern mapping of the Russian Empire. So it gets the whole empire from the Kingdom of Poland to the Pacific to Russian America. And I thought, okay, here's what I'm going to do. It looks like this, and it contains, I think, 59 sheets, one sheet per province, right? One sheet per province. The fun thing, now, if you know anything about maps, it will come in handy when I say this next sentence, is that many of the sheets, the maps are done at different scales and in different projections. Okay, I heard some gasps, so that makes me feel better, right? So because they're mapping everything from a small province in maybe like Estland, right, to Tobolsk, right? And it's hard to fit different size spaces onto the same size piece of paper. So there's an incredible amount of mathematical work that goes into doing that. So I had all of these. So what I essentially did, and I did some of the work myself, and then I got some help, was cut out all of those little pictures of provinces and then figure out how to stitch them all together and how to lay them over a contemporary base map and do a thing called georeferencing, which basically means you take an image, you lay it over a base map, and you teach the image where it is in the world, and you assign coordinates to every pixel in the image. So this is the map of, this is the sheet for Moscow, just to give you a sense of what it contains. All kinds of different pieces of information about the surrounding borders. It gives all kinds of information about settlement type, about different roads, different kinds of rivers. So I thought, this is a worthy source to work on because I can extract. I don't need this map. I don't need this atlas to tell me where Moscow is. I do know where it is, but I don't know how all the road networks connected to one another. And if I go to Google and I ask Google or Yandex or whatever, hey, can you show me the boundaries of Tavricheskaya gubernia in 1820? It doesn't know. It doesn't have an answer, right? So it was a lot of work, but this is part of the result. So this is what it looks like. And if this map is currently being migrated to a new platform, but if you looked at my project, a year or two ago, you would have seen this online, and you will see it again. This is the mosaic that we created from that atlas. It's all just stitched together. And because we georeferenced it, we could then extract all of the geographic information from it. So we extracted provincial boundaries, so you can see the different colored polygons, and the districts, right? So the uyezd boundaries. So I know where all of the uyezdi were in the Russian Empire, right, in the 1820s. All of the various kinds of settlements, the villages with the derevnya, this, sela, uyezdni goroda, all the different kinds of towns. We have all of the different kinds of roads, the roads maintained at the provincial level, the district level, carriage roads, and bodies of water, lakes, rivers that have names, rivers that don't have names. And then what happens, and as you'll see, as Nazarke is clicking through, you'll see that sometimes a sheet is going to include all of those layers, and sometimes it doesn't. And this is, again, one of the reasons to work in a GIS environment, because you're able to separate layers of information and toggle them on and off as needed. Right, so this is an interactive benefit for the researcher, right? You don't have to look at all of that at the same time if you don't want to. You can separate, if you've organized your data properly, right? You can filter it, you can combine it in different ways, which makes it, in theory, easier to identify spatial patterns, consistencies, inconsistencies, right? This is a very basic form of spatial analysis. So the work, so hang on here one second. So the work involved in that produced a whole system of geographic information that I can then use to say, okay, I have the Pocztowa Kniga, right? I know how many itinerary stops there were, post stations, right? If someone wanted to travel from St. Petersburg to Kazan, for example. I have the geographic information that describes every single post station in the Russian Empire. And I can say, oh, I can calculate how many versti they had to travel, but I can also now say, well, how many provincial boundaries did you have to cross? And how many villages were located within a day's walk of that route, right? And how many people lived in those villages? So having this whole system of geographic information allows me to start asking questions that I could ask before, but couldn't easily answer, right? So there's a massive payoff just to doing that whole process of georeferencing, feature extraction, and then playing with all the data that you get from that. So then the next thing that we did, we thought, oh, sorry, go back one slide. So then we thought, okay, I've gone through, we manually extracted all that information, and there's something like 15,000 pieces of information, right, that we pulled from that atlas. And that's great, but wouldn't it be nice if a computer could do some of that for us, right? It's not so much fun to manually go and extract all of the toponyms from a map like this. So we thought, oh, here's a good project. We'll see if we can use image processing software, Google Cloud Vision, basically. The things that, the kinds of scary image processing technology that's used to monitor traffic, right? Traffic patterns and things like that. Maybe we could use that and teach Google how to look at maps of the Russian Empire and recognize what it contains. Like, let's try this out. So I had a Riga student, a graduate student in the Riga program, who was just amazing and who went through this process. And so she tried to teach to use algorithms to see if she could extract information. Okay, so she was looking, we were just trying to get the names of places, the toponyms, place names, to see if Google could do that. So she worked on three different provinces. This is looking at the Kingdom of Poland. We have Warsaw, and you can see various ways that gets represented in toponyms. Go ahead. So she ran this map through the image processing algorithm, the tool, and it was able to recognize anything that is in a rectangle was recognized as a piece of text that then the computer was able to extract. So this is really, really exciting, right? We could just do this and not have to manually extract all these place names. The color of the rectangle is associated with whether or not the computer, we'll just call it the machine, well, whether or not the machine was able to actually accurately translate the pixels into letters. Let's go ahead. So it wasn't so great at that. It was really great at figuring out where the text was, but it turns out that the machine isn't so good at recognizing various, especially manuscript. It's good at printed type, but not at manuscript type. It can be taught, right? It's like a young child. It can be taught, but it isn't born knowing how to do this. So we got varying results, but a pretty relatively high, percentage of correct toponyms. And it depended, okay, we'll hold here for a second. And it depended on whether or not there was, for example, a road that just happened to be running through the name of a town. If that happened, the computer would cry and crash and, couldn't read the text. But we went through that process and developed a method that we have documented, right? So we can now use that method on any set of maps we want and improve the method. And we know what we have to do to make the method better. So that's it's a classic kind of example of the work that I like to do, is to have a problem, experiment with some sort of process, right? Methodological innovation. And the goal is to choose problems that other people share with me, right? So if I can solve this problem for myself and solve it for all of you, that's what I wanted to do, right? It's all about kind of reducing everyone else's pain at doing this. So here's my favorite. I will admit, this one is my favorite. So this is, if you've heard of Semyon Remezov, I don't know if you have, but he was, of course you have, 17th century kind of jack of all trades, a guy who did everything, who lived in Tobolsk, and he was an icon painter and a chancellery official. He did all kinds of things. And he was commissioned by Peter the Great in 1696 to make an atlas of Siberia, right? Which he did. And he was probably the only person in the entire empire who could pull it off. So his manuscripts there, he attempted to do this 3 times. And we have at Harvard, it's a great thing about Harvard, but it's also a little bit, dicey, but we have the only copy that has ever existed of one of those attempts. So we have it at Houghton Library, which is great for me. And happily, there's a beautifully digitized version of this. So everyone can access this online, not just me, all of you can. So here's a sampling of what, yeah, go ahead, it's fine. A sampling of what the maps look like. And I think we'll zoom in next to see, yes. So here's an example. Isn't it? It is, I get so excited about this map again. This is one of the most beautiful pieces of cartography, I think, that has ever been produced in the Russian space, in Eurasian space. So what do you see when you look at this? And this, you actually do have to answer. What do you see? What sense can you make of this? Squiggly lines, curvy lines, and it's blue, right? And we know that every river in the world is always blue, right? That's how, no. So this is one of the classic conventions of cartography. You have been taught that when there is a blue line on a map, it's a river. That is a completely arbitrary decision, right? And anyone who's making a map, if they wanted to, they could make those lines yellow, right? They could make them black or purple, and it would still be a river. And this is a really important thing, right? The fact that we are trained to recognize certain things in maps. It's second nature, it's instinctive to us. There's a visual language that we and this is a thing to be aware of, right? And to know when it's happening. So there are, yes, those are absolutely right. They're rivers, right? And tributaries. And there are, I'm guessing one of the reasons why you said this map is cute is because there are those beautiful little cute trees, right? Right, they're adorable, right? And they're all over the map. And there are different, if you look closely, you'll see there are different kinds of trees. And maybe that's Remezov being cute. And maybe that's Remezov saying, well, there are deciduous trees and there are fir, pine, what are they called? Oh my gosh, coniferous, thank you, coniferous trees, right? And if you were to do an exhaustive study of this atlas, which some people have done, right, you would find out that in fact, there is a very complicated system of using text and pictorial symbols to tell us an awful lot, whether or not it's accurate information or not, to tell us an awful lot about where the trees were, where the forests were, where the rivers were, where the non-Russian settlements were, where the Russian settlements were, where the fords and the bridges and the swamps, and just an incredible array of information.
Some of our online participants also mentioned roads.
And roads, yes. And can you tell, where are the roads? I can't see roads. Help me. The brown lines that look like stains, right? They look like roads.
Or maybe the dotted lines, no?
What?
The dashed that lines, no?
There are the dotted red lines. Oh, so there are two candidates. So there's dotted red lines, or there's the yellow stain looking lines. Which one are they both roads? Yeah, the dashes. The dashes are the routes. They're really not roads, right? But they are rough gestures towards how one could proceed through space. And if you were, so they're essentially, a lot of them are kind of part of caravan routes. Some of them are not. Some of them are just how one would move through Siberian space. And in a lot of the sheets, there are notations that tell you if, it takes 2 days to float down the river from here to there, right? And the system of symbology is really complicated, but there's an incredible amount of transportation information in this map. The yellow lines that look like stains, they're not roads. Those are actually Remezov's really interesting way of showing us elevation change. So along those rivers, as most of you I'm sure know, where you will have across Eurasia and across Siberia, right? These rivers, there's a ravine on either side, right? They're cut down into the territory. And those yellow lines actually show you where those ravines are. So in most, not everywhere, but in most cases in the map, you'll see that the little squares that represent settlements are on the other side of those lines. So anyway, it's a very, very, very complicated cartographic endeavor. And I thought, it is really cute. It's really beautiful. It's also really important. It was done in the 17th century according to traditional Russian cartographic technology. There's no Cartesian grid here. You can't see latitude and longitude, right? There's not a compass. As Andrei was saying, some of these maps are oriented north to south or south to north. It changes all the time on a diagonal. So they're very, very, very difficult. It's hard to take these maps and match them with contemporary maps. But I thought, why not try, right? So this is one of the things that I'm working on. We can skip this one. It's just another example. So these are more examples just to give you a flavor for the map. So design can be a tool. So when I ask myself this question, how can I take this atlas and create data from it? I did recognize that although there is no latitude or longitude, there are lots of keys, and there are two major keys. In terms of taking these maps and laying them onto base maps, what I did was kind of go along the river routes and find known locations. So there are a lot of settlement names here that have persisted from the 17th century to the present day. So I identified on some of those settlements, marked them on the map, and marked them on contemporary GIS. And then I noticed that every sheet in this atlas has a grid. It doesn't have latitude and longitude. This is just a drafting grid. It was used to copy information onto the page, but it's systematic, and it allows me to say, in A1, column A, row 1, it looks like there's a river and there's, well, there's not much there. In A2, in this one, there's a nomadic settlement or a non-Russian settlement. There's a Russian settlement. There's a little kind of fortification and a pit of voz, right? So I can go to my data and I can record, okay, in grid space A2, all of those things are present, right? I can't do it with a great level of geographic accuracy, but at the level of that grid space, I can record all the data. So I did. I went through the whole entire atlas and wrote down where all of the trees are according to the grid location. And then I thought, okay, let's see if we can bring this into the map, onto the GIS map, right? So this is a GIS map of that region. And I took those known settlement locations that I found, right? I said, oh, I know this place. I found the coordinates for it, and I plotted them. And then I used them to drop the sheets onto into the GIS, reorienting them. And this is just a zoom in so you can see, and you can play with the transparency. And I knew I can't make a perfect match, right? So this isn't about perfect accuracy. This is just a rough cut. And I did it for a bunch of maps. And then I thought, it's too much. I can't really see what I'm looking at. So I'm going to let the maps fall away. So I just represented the map spaces that way. And if you do that for all of the maps, like imagine this for all 169 maps in this atlas, which I've not done it for all of them yet. You're then able to represent the space of Remezov's choreograficheskaya kniga roughly, right, as it was mapped at different scales. And you can start to see that the maps themselves, they're different sized rectangles because they're done at different scales, right, as well. You can start to see and lay that onto contemporary data layers from contemporary GIS. So this is vegetation layer, which is very modern. It's from just a couple of years ago. There's a lot of really amazing data out there. And then you can start to say, well, Remezov told me there was a forest there. Let's just look and see if there's still trees, right? According to modern data. What about if we could use Remezov's 1696 atlas to do a bit of longue durée environmental history, right, of Eurasia? Wouldn't that be amazing? Right? I think that'd be so fun. So you can get down to that grid level. You can't get any more accurate than that, but you can get to that. And so that's one of the things that I'm doing, right? It's a combination of using specialized training, right, as a historian, knowing something about the region, and using technology, right, and bringing those things together to experiment, right, and just to see what can be done, just to see what can Remezov tell us about river systems and how does it compare to what we know about geographic space now. And it's not a matter of saying whether Remezov was right or wrong, right? And it's not an authoritative description of space, but it is an interesting set of research questions that can be derived from that kind of work.
The different reference points that you're lining up are not going to be the same distance from one another as there. So are you distorting Remezov's maps to make them correspond?
Right. So that is a thing that one generally has to do, especially if the map that you're using was made prior to the middle of the 19th century, and especially if the map you're using covers anything bigger than an UES, right? There's going to be distortion when you do georeferencing. So no, I'm actually not. I'm only using those known location points as a general reference. I don't actually want to distort the maps themselves because I know they're never going to accurately line up. So I'm keeping the integrity of the rectangular shape and of that grid, and using it at that level. So it's very explicitly not, the accuracy only goes so far.
Because the river is going to be different. The banks are going to be
the
different.
rivers are going to be completely different, right? So it's only a gesture of, matching. But the interesting thing is that a lot of, the beauty of those maps comes from the way that the rivers are depicted with their oxbows, their twists and their turns. You would be astonished at how many of them still show up on contemporary, maps. So it's an interesting thing. There will be a lot of change, but there is consistency enough to make it worth, I think, doing, Yeah, it's a great question. So one last thing I'll show you, and then I'll stop and you can ask me questions. I can show you more, but I'm thinking you're tired. Last thing, there is another, I like to work on sets of maps because it allows me to try out methods more easily. Another set of maps that exists is the set of town plans of the Russian Empire that were kind of commissioned by Catherine the Great and produced over a series of decades, and then compiled and published as part of the Polные Sobranie Zakonov in 1830. This volume came out in 1839, I believe. So it's an addenda to the Polные Sobranie Zakonov Российской империи. And so it contains 417 уездные и губернские города. And so I thought, what can we learn about Russian urban space, right? By looking at these town plans. Here's an example of what they look like. Here's the material. They're all systematically done. So you get information about, you have a legend at the bottom, and the legend tells you the things that exist, and it tells you the things that are planned to exist, right? That's what it looks like. So now the question, I'm showing you this because I want you to imagine that you're a computer. I want you to imagine that you're a machine and you are trying to figure out what that says. It's actually, that's pretty doable, right? As a human, you can probably read that, right? Okay. But they're not all that great, right? The quality isn't all that great. There are lots of different copies of this that exist in various libraries, but the quality isn't all that great. So there is a fair amount of work that cannot be automated and has to be slogged through by the human, me. But you can go into these maps and you can isolate all of the features that they name, and you can identify them and create a database from them. This is Mali Yaroslavets. This is Chernikov, and this is a nice one. There are lots of green spaces. You can identify whether they're public buildings, government buildings, trade-based places, lots of bodies of water, breweries, cemeteries, meat slaughterhouses, salt storage, grain storage, all kinds of things. So you can get, a lot of data about how Russian towns were planned, not how they really were necessarily, but how the plans said they were supposed to be, right? Which is an interesting question. That's Saratov. It's actually one of my favorite maps in the set. And then you can take all of that data and then you can bring it into a GIS system, and you can just to visualize the scope of data that you pulled from a source like that. And these are not beautiful maps. These are not cute or beautiful in any way, but you can at least get a sense of the content. So here are the provinces. And so this next map will show you kind of where all of the towns are. Again, it's not beautiful, I know. Go ahead. But then you can see how many features are represented at each of those different locations. So you can see, for example, you can see that giant dot, right? That's Saratov. There are a lot of features on that map. But a lot of the maps, the plans, have very few features named on them. They're not very complicated urban spaces. And that's what this is showing us. And you can break that down to see which towns had a lot of plans for the future and which had a lot more things planned in existence. And just, you can zoom in so you can see this a little bit. This is the last thing I'll show you. You can just zoom in to make it easier to see, and you can see which, I put a little blob on the provincial towns so you can differentiate them from the uyezd towns. So that's the current features at each location. And you can kind of see that, not surprisingly, Moscow has a lot of current features. Some of the other surrounding towns don't. And then if you change to looking at planned features, what was supposed to happen, you will see that the Russian government, in theory, intended to invest in, or expected there to be a lot more dynamic change in district towns, right, than in provincial towns that were already more developed. So there are some kind of expected guesses that we can confirm using these sources, but there are a lot of really interesting patterns about how urban spaces were shaped or expected to be shaped, that these might be the only sources that would allow us to kind of get at some of that. And we can visualize, of course, this kind of information all kinds of different ways. And I like this one. It's very, very basic, but it shows you these are the things that were planned. Oh, sorry, this got a little smushed. So this big block shows you, I categorized them, that what existed on the plans that were made in the Catherinian period. If you see blue, that's religious. So if you're looking, the urban space of Russia that was mapped in the reign of Catherine the Great was mostly all religious stuff. So it was churches and cathedrals. And what was planned, see the shrinking of that blue space, right? They're not planning to build a lot of churches and cathedrals, right? The idea is the green, that's trade, and the space for government offices, that there's going to be a lot more dynamic change in those fields. So you can kind of just get a neat sense of change over time. And yep, just another one. And we can talk about these or not, but that's really what I wanted to show you. And the last thing I wanted to tell you, we can go to the last slide, is that one of the things that I believe in quite deeply is that the work that the sources that I build, the methods that I try to develop, and the data that I produce should be openly accessible to anyone in the world. And so it's been a kind of process to think about how to do that and make that happen in an elegant-ish way. But I have just started. Last week, I started publishing data, and every 2 weeks, we will be publishing a new data set that describes some aspect of Russian history. And everything is open access. It's available on something called Dataverse, and you can download the files, and they come with explanations of what it contains, code books, and how to use it, a lot of spatial data, so that anyone could come along, and if they're interested in mapping gardens of Crimea from the 18th century, or if you want to know where all the chocolate factories were, or the confectionery shops in the second half of the 19th century, all kinds of different things. You can come to our Dataverse and download the data, and you don't have to look at the way I map it. You can just go take that data and build your own historical project. So I'm excited. I'm hoping that people will enjoy playing with that. That's what we do.
And then at some point, it's part of Tsyrempilov is part of Stepnoy Krai. And another point, I think after 1898, it goes back to Turkestan, and that changes the map. And so I'm wondering if there's a way that your project can capture this dynamic change over time as well, because you can't often make these kind of assumptions. You can't often map directly.
Yeah, no, it's a really important thing. It's a caution. You always need to make sure that your spatial data matches your whatever tabular data. So if you have information about IMPERIIA, you need to make sure that the boundaries that you're using describe IMPERIIA at that time, or whatever administrative unit you're using. So capturing the changing of the boundaries is a very time-intensive project, and there are various ways of approaching it. And so what I have I have the early 19th century done reasonably accurately, and because of the accuracy of that set, I'm moving through the 19th century and adapting those boundaries slowly over time. So I have the set for the 1850s, and I'm working my way forward. It's a complicated thing, but it definitely can be done. It just takes a lot of really careful work to think about how to best capture all of that in the most efficient way. It's tough, and it's so tough that I actually set that aside for about 7 years because it was too overwhelming, and I just kind of came back to that over the last few months because I think I'm a little bit better at doing things like that now. But that's a great opportunity for collaboration if anyone wants to collaborate.
Me? Hi. This is I mean, I've seen an iteration of this. before, in fact. But I always feel excited, as if I see it for the first time. Your presentation, I mean, and I, you know, of course, the most important reason why I feel excited is that I think, like yourself, and like I'm sure Professor Bykov, who is not here, I share this love for maps, and I think it is, well, I think love is an appropriate word here. I think my own conversions from the dinosaurs to history took place via historical atlases. I don't know how it was for others, but for me it was like this. But I have this nagging doubt that, in a way, maps force us into a kind of positivist impasse, and that is actually ultimately what Aristotle's statement was about: positivism, right? If it's what is this? What is nowhere is what's
What is not is nowhere.
what is not is nowhere. But I mean, obviously, the God's tag or whatever it is somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, it's in Aristotle's head, to be sure, and and this is what I was actually wondering. And I think Professor Bykov kind of had this Freudian slip that said, well, the map is inaccurate, but inaccuracy is not an inaccuracy. I mean, it is an inaccuracy from the positivist perspective, but it's also a reflection of many other things. It's a reflection of particular approach to space, which of course is not linear. And this is what I'm saying. I see such a tremendous value to this, and I see lots of boys and girls like myself being converted from the dinosaurs to history, thanks to all those maps. Right? That's what you were talking about. You want people who know nothing about Peter the Great being converted into this, right? And this is it. I see. But then at the same time, there is this danger that map projects, I guess, can say, is that they create an impression of a certain linearity, right? That there is a certain framework of thinking about the space that had been, well, I mean, more or less the same, right? More or less the same, marked only by inaccuracies that are, of course, due to their being, less knowledgeable about things.
Absolutely. It's massively dangerous, but I think the danger isn't inherent in the maps. I think that the danger is inherent in how we are taught to think about maps and how common it is for us to be uncritical when it comes to maps, right? So when most people encounter a map, they expect it to be an objective thing. They don't think of it as a complex, socially and culturally constructed object, which it is. No map is objectively true. It just isn't. Even the NASA grade satellite maps, there's a huge amount of cultural baggage behind that. And one of the, I think, the things that it's terribly important is for us to improve our kind of fluency in how to understand the kind of cartographic machine that's been shaping the way that we think about space over time. So it's not enough to, it's probably all I can do to kind of do this kind of work, but there's a much larger project to think about how we train our students and ourselves to think about space, right? One of the redeeming features, I think, about working in a GIS environment rather than an environment of static mapping is that you can build in some of that kind of complexity. You can play in interesting ways with how people perceive the data that you're using. And you can disaggregate the information from the map, right? Which I think is quite important, because when you only have the map, then you're working in this kind of closed system. Whereas if you retain some flexibility between the information and the way it's been designed and shaped, then at least you create a little bit of space for interpretation and for critical thinking. But I take your caution is absolutely spot on. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for fascinating presentation. I have a very simple and practical question. I know that your project is run by a whole team. You're a director of the project, right? And how things are, how the functions, duties are distributed throughout the team, who is responsible for what, how it works?
Well, that is a really interesting question because I had a team of maybe 9 people working with me pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and the members of my team were probably all fine, but as a mother of 3 children, it was very difficult to maintain all of that through the pandemic with my children at home with me sharing the kitchen table. I had we were doing preschool and 1st grade and 6th grade all together at the kitchen table. And that kind of, so when that hit, it really changed the whole dynamic of the project, right? And it kind of shrunk it down. So I have 2 students who are working with me now through the pandemic. And now I'm finally kind of back at the moment where, okay, I need to build back out again. So over the for a few years, there was like this robust energy. We had plenty of labor. I had people to do machine learning projects for me. And now through no fault of anyone else's, I blame it exclusively on the pandemic. It's a much smaller team right now. And so now I'm thinking about how, scaling back up and thinking really strategically about what my goals are and what is feasible. And I think one of the things I've learned over time is how much time has to be invested in what kind of work. So I have a better sense of how to manage that moving forward. So you've caught me at a moment where I'm now, pivoting back toward, I have informal, contributions from lots of people, but not a formal big team right now. So yeah, it's an interesting question and a necessary question for projects like this, as you know. Yeah.
Hello. I'm also very amazed by the work that you have done. And my question is, how do you think, usually in humanitarian sciences, knowledge is produced and reproduced like through articles or books, and now your project is something different. And I'm interested, how do you think the methods of delivering knowledge or translating knowledge will become different because of these new methods? I mean, you cannot just write an article on the basis of this project because it is so huge, and you cannot explain so much what you have done before, so that you came to this particular conclusion. For example,
Right.
you explained so much to us today, but it is hard to be explained in an article. So how do you think it will change?
It is such an important question. I have the privilege of working at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and the privilege of that position, there are many privileges to that, but one of the things is that I am not a faculty member. I was a faculty member for a long time. I went through that process, and I'm not a graduate student. So I don't need to worry about going through the kind of publication regime, right, that is necessary in the academic world, which has not changed, and I don't anticipate will change anytime soon. I did write a book and I have done articles and all of that, but I don't have to worry about that right now. What I have to worry about is how to produce the new genres of history that would enable work like this to not just be delivered to anyone who has an internet connection, but to be valued by my fellow historians, right? And that is a tricky thing. So happily, I'm not the only one who's doing this kind of thing, right? Digital humanities is a growing field, and there are new kind of peer-reviewed kind of digital online publication sites where this kind of thing can happen, but there are no easy answers to the question that you're asking. And doing this kind of work does mean that you do have to know that you're not writing a book out of this, right? That is not the natural conclusion to this. So in a sense, engaging in this kind of work also means engaging in innovating what history should look like, and how, as I said, how it can be produced in a way that it can be evaluated by serious scholars, as well as being enjoyed by anyone. And that takes a lot of careful work and a lot of careful thinking. But it's also really fun.